Certainly good to see everyone. We have a good number. We do have visitors. Thank you for coming. You're welcome back at any time here that you have the opportunity to worship with us here at Sandyville. We worship God in spirit and in truth and as instructed. Had a good Bible study. Appreciate the songs by Dave. Appreciate the prayers that have been uttered. Jeff, appreciate that. We've had a good worship service thus far, and we're thankful that you're here. I want to remind everyone that next week, next Lord's Day is Friends and Family Day. There are flyers there in the back. I ran off quite a few copies, and if you need more, just let me know. Give you a heads up last week to start thinking about some of those friends and some of those families that you need to invite, and get that address on an envelope, get that flyer in there, personalize it, and invite them to next Lord's Day. A little bit different take next Lord's Day as we usually do. We'll have the worship service, then we'll have a covered dish dinner, and following that, then we'll gather back in here and we will have a sing, and there will be no evening service. So if we wrap up about 1:15, we're going to come right back in here, 1:30, somewhere in that area. So we look forward to that day, unless, again, what makes it a successful day is that it does give you an opportunity to invite friends, to invite family, and everybody in this room has a friend or a family that needs to hear the gospel, that needs to come with you to worship God. So let's make some effort in that behalf. You know, you think about the statement, worthless religion. You think about hearing this person's religion is worthless. Now, what comes to your mind when you think that, and you hear somebody say that? Well, it might be the guy that you picture in your mind that he maybe is a Buddhist, and he is in front of the idol Buddha, and he's bowing down to Buddha. You would say that that person's religion is worthless. Or, and I've done it, and maybe you've seen it more and more of late, there's a fellow alongside the road at a certain time of day. He's got a rug that is spread out there beside the road, and he's on his knees. He's praying. He's facing toward the east. First thing that comes to my mind is that fellow's religion is worthless. But if you know anything about the book of James, you'll know that in some of the scripture that James writes, that statement is in the last part of one of the verses that he writes. Notice with me, James chapter 1, verse 26. James says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, he says this person's religion is worthless. Now I want you to think for a minute what James is saying. James has a real good way of taking complex things that are in the scriptures, things that might be hard to understand, some ideas, and he has a way of putting them into terms that you and I can understand. When we hear the term worthless religion, we automatically think about maybe idolatry, persons that are worshiping idols, or we think about somebody that's worshiping the wrong God. But James comes along and he says, you know what? If you don't control your tongue, your religion, James says, is worthless. Now this morning, I want us to concentrate on that idea. I want us to concentrate and ask ourselves a question, is my religion worthless? As James would look at me, or as God would look at me, and look at the things that I do, look at the things that I say, and more importantly, and as later in this passage will reveal, not so much as what is seen, but what is inside me, what is in my heart, as God would look at that. How is my light? How is my influence in the world? And so we think on those terms, and as far as answering the question, is my religion worthless? As we talk about James' wording here, the term religion, I want you to know that this is the only time in the New Testament that the tense of the verb is used in this way. When James says the word religion, as he looks at that idea, what it applies to really is, the outward aspects of religion. And for lack of a better word, I guess we could use the word ceremony. That's what he's talking about. So as James brings out this point, he's going to say that a religion that is solely based on this outward appearance or this outward ceremony, he says it's worthless, it's not good. In fact, the point that he brings out as we look at this text, any religion that views that God is correct in his sight, a religion that is interested and consecrated on the God respect of obedience, this is right. And this is what James wants us to see. Here's what James is saying, that you cannot simply rely on the outward appearance of things. You can't do that. What's on the outside? You can't rely on the ceremony is right. That if you say that the ceremony and the things on the outside are right, then everything is all right. Then James is saying you're not okay with your religion, no matter what you might think or believe. Now what's interesting about this is I believe that James brings forth in the text one of the most difficult things in religion, and that is the idea of not just simply concentrating on what is seen, but James is concentrating on what cannot be seen, the things that are in the heart, and to understand that those things require of us an obedience of God. I'll say this about the passage. James could have used any number of ideas. He could have used any number of illustrations to illustrate his point. What he did here, he took the tongue. He made the point about the tongue, control of the tongue. Now let me say again, he could have used any number of examples. What James is not saying here is that if you've got your tongue under control, that everything's all right with your religion. That if you can master the tongue, then you don't have to worry about it. You've got everything under control. That's not what he's saying. But instead what he's doing is he's picking out this one thing to illustrate that if you say that you're religious, if you say that you have religion, if you say that you have the religion that you ought to be, that you ought to have, that is deep within inside you, it's going to be reflected and it's going to be illustrated by the words that you speak. That's what he's saying. We're going to realize that. Well, and I look at that and I think, just looking at the text and the book, there may have been some problems with the people, and really this is something kind of dear to James's heart. There may have been problems with the people that he was addressing. But I think that James looked overall, just looked at Christians in general, and I think he recognized the problem, he realized the problem, and he said, you know what? This is an area that all of us must deal with. All of us have a problem with this. And so I look at that. Why did James choose the example of the tongue when he could have chosen many things? I guess he answers that in his book. He talks about the idea of the tongue and the control of it. He says, first of all, you need to understand that this is a message for every man and for every woman. James chapter 3. Now, I suppose this is a great text for dealing with controlling of the tongue, the challenge of correct speech, and the things about the challenge of correct speech is the things that proceed out of the heart. Look what he says in verse 2. He says, for we all stumble in many ways. And if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. If we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are strong, they are large, and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder whenever the will of the pilot, he says, directs. James is saying to us, you know what, when you think about your tongue, it's something that gets everybody in trouble. It's something that everybody's got to think about in order that we do not say the wrong things. It's a challenge for all of us. He goes on to say it's a challenge for all of us because it can create all kinds of trouble if we don't bridle the tongue. Verse 5. He says, so also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting, he says, on fire the entire course of life, he says, and set on fire by hell. That's strong language. James is saying here, you need to be careful because we allow the words that we speak, guess where they originate? They originate here, he says, with the devil himself. And those words that come from there have the ability to bring people down. That's why it's so serious that we guard what we say. He goes on to say that the tongue, that our speech actually reveals who we really are. Look at verse 9. With this, he says, we bless our Lord, our Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond, he says, yield fresh water. Here we are in the same turn. One hand, we are praising God. We are talking about God. And then on the other hand, we are cursing our brother. You know what that says about your heart? It's a hypocritical heart. You have a hypocritical heart if you're able to do that. We can see that. We can understand that. The Lord understood that. The Lord realized that when he said, do you not see that what goes in the mouth, that it passes into the stomach and that it is expelled? He talks about that. But then on the other hand, what comes out of the mouth? Where does that proceed from, Jesus said? It proceeds from the heart. He says, this is what defiles a person. Jesus says, the way that you speak is a great indication of your heart. The way that you talk is a great indication of what's going on in here. It's a great indication of your thought process. That's what the Lord's saying. So as we look at this idea, we understand that an unbridled tongue represents an unrestrained heart. It represents a person that's not kept in bounds, in those restraints. It's not that pure religion that we should have. And it's effective in so many areas. We could talk about the book of Proverbs. There's so many passages in the scriptures about the tongue, about what it can do, gossiping, about backbiting. There's so many areas, and we know that that's wrong. We know that that's not right. And yet we find ourselves saying things that we shouldn't, about people that we shouldn't. That's absolutely none of our business. We do that. That's why James is saying that what you say is a sign of your religion. We think about lying, how easy it is. You know what, when the truth gets us in trouble, I'll tell you what, we can lie. We can get right out of that. It's easy to do that. The truth's going to get you in trouble, but I'm the worst liar in the world. Every time I did it, it's deeper and deeper for me. It's bad. So I guess that's how I learned to tell the truth maybe, because I just kept getting beat up with a lie. All right? So learn that way. But we keep getting in trouble. You know, when you talk about the term corrupt communication, you know, it is a very generic term. But many of us, when we hear and we talk about James and what he says about the tongue, even though it is a generic term, we want to specify it through profanity. And we want to know the list, who made the list, what are the profane words, why are they there? I don't think they're profane. We can talk all night and day about that. But corrupt would cover many things. Corrupt communication. It would cover the words that you use. It would cover the profanity that's used, the cursings that you use. It would cover all those things. But you know what? Besides all those things, there is a way to have corrupt communication. Ever been to a ball game and the kid at bat, the mom sitting beside you thinks he's going to be the next Pete Rose, and he hits the ball, and it's obviously fair, and the umpire says foul ball, and she stands up and she screams. You ever done that? You ever seen that? Ever been there? I have. I've seen that. And have you ever thought about corrupt communication being the idea of saying some things that are not curse words, that are not profanity, that are not gossip, but communicating in a way that's just not appropriate. The words that we say is not bespeaking of a man who is after the Lord's heart. Sometimes the way we communicate is not bespeaking of a person that wants to live peaceably with all men. It's just not. James says, if we do not have that kind of control, if we don't recognize that, he says we must look at our religion and understand that we are showing a heart that is unrestrained. That's what he's saying. I'd like to add one more. And that is sometimes, and I've done it of late, in entering a discussion about religious ideas. I've talked to brethren in the church that I think sometimes I don't even know why I'm in the same room, because I get they don't have a clue what they're talking about. And that's okay, but do your homework. If you want to argue something about the Bible, be able to stand up for what you believe in and put your finger on it, not just what somebody, your dad told you, or you've always believed this and you don't know why. You don't have faith in it, but really what you're doing, you just want to argue the point and win the match, I guess. Folks, that's vain talk. That's worthless talk. That's no good. We simply want to win that point. So James' idea is the point that when we are not in control, is what he's saying, our actions do not conform to the standard of God. But he goes on in this verse, and he speaks with this idea in this verse of worthless religion. Let's note it again. He says, again, if anyone thinks he's religious, does not bridle his tongue, he deceives his heart. He says this person's religion is worthless. The word deception in the book of James comes up several times. Here in the beginning it comes up in the opening section, and I believe we come across this passage here, this line here, and really it's one of the scariest things that I think James writes about this passage. James is saying that you can so deceive yourself, that you can so deceive yourself into thinking that you have the outward right, that you have the ceremony right, that you have it all intact, that you're so good at having this right that you can actually deceive yourself and talk yourself into and convincing yourself that, you know what, everything with your religion is okay. That's what James says. That everything in your life is okay because you can be so good at that. Folks, that is a very, very dangerous situation. Because if we rely on the outward action and the ceremony and the appearance of things as proof that everything is okay, I tell you what, you fall into a group of people that really left a very good example of what a very bad example is. Matthew chapter 23. I think the Lord spoke this sermon to the Pharisees, one of the fieriest sermons that he preached, or one of the lessons that he preached. Listen to what he says as we make this point. I want you to think about James. Chapter 23, verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean out the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisee hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy. He says, and lawlessness. The Lord is saying, you know what? It's easy to make the outside look good. It's easy to make the outside look good. And if you're only concerned about making the outside look good, your religion is worthless. That's what he's saying. And so James takes this idea of what the Lord is saying here and says, you know what? Get that example. You know what? You can't control your speech. You're a lot like that plate. You're a lot like that cup. You're a lot like that whitewashed tomb. That on the outside, you're looking pretty good. But on the inside, you are full of all uncleanness. So James says, if you're not in control, if you're not conforming to the standards of God, and thus, if not, your religion may very well be worthless. You know what? That's a point. We've got to realize that. And folks, each and every one of us must examine our life. We must look at our life, and we must realize that if we are undisciplined in our religion, if we are undisciplined in our belief, if we are undisciplined in our practice and our conviction, God is saying in very clear, very stark, very attention-getting terms that you need to realize what you're doing. You need to recognize that you need to come to grips with that. And you need to make changes if it's necessary. We need to do that. Worthless religion. Is it I? Well, we don't want that. We don't want our religion to be worthless. We don't want to be a people who have worthless religion. We want our religion to mean something. We want it to be pure. God looks at the inward. God looks at the outward actions that we have. I want him to look at me. I want him to look at us. And I want him to say, that's the way the religion that I've spoke of ought to be. That's what I want. And so James is going to choose another illustration for us. And again, like the tongue that he chose to illustrate a point, he could have chose many, he chooses another illustration to illustrate this point about pure religion. Verse 27, let's go back to James 1. Look what he says. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their afflictions and to keep oneself unstained, he says, from the world. James again chose this illustration about the tongue for worthless religion, and now he chooses this illustration about the point of what pure religion is. Now, as I look at James, I'm not surprised that he chose this. I believe these are near and dear to God's heart. Historically in the scriptures, when you look at who God cared for, recognized, worried about, really this is two of the four groups that he always was concerned about. The other two are the poor, the stranger. The poor, the stranger, the widow, the orphan. That's who God's concerned about. That's the groups that from the beginning that I can see that God is always concerned about. And he says, I want you to make sure that they're cared for. Look what he says in Psalms 68. 68th Psalm, verse 5. Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. Now we often have names for God, and rightly so. We describe God as all powerful. We describe God as with his greatness. But here in this, God is describing himself. I watch out for orphans. I watch out for the widows. And God says, you know what? When you do that, you are imitating me. That's what he says. As you care for these people, what you're doing, you are imitating what I would have you do. Just like God. And the point is made here in James that you know what? We can only realize to do this kind of thing as part of our religion so that we might be pure. James is saying that you need to make sure that you are pure and holy in your religion, because if you're not going to do it. You won't do it. Now that idea is not new. In Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, notice what Isaiah says in chapter 1, verse 6. Isaiah chapter 1, 16, sorry. He says, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. There's the cleaning. There's the cleansing. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Here's the purity. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Correct oppression. Bring justice to the fatherless. Plead, he says, the widow's case. Isn't that interesting? Once again, we're seeing God. He's saying, you've got to get rid of the filth. You've got to get rid of the uncleanness in your life. You've got to get rid of the unworthiness, and then you must be active in the sense of doing the things that you know you ought to do. That's what he's saying. But first you've got to get rid of that and realize what you need to do to produce pure religion. And isn't that the point of James? What's James say? We're to be doers of the word, not hearers only. Take what you know and put it into action so that we can see your religion. You know, this illustration for us about our religion being pure, you know, what it needs to be, caring for others, especially those who have that, and I look at that, they don't have the ability to repay you. You think about the first century widow. You think about the first century orphan. You think about somebody that has lost their only source of income. During 2,000 years ago, can you imagine the oppression, the heartache that would bring on somebody? And even today. I know there are things put in place that it might not be as severe. But I'll tell you what, folks, things still come up. There are things that are still needed. So James illustrates the concept of pure religion. He says you need to make sure you're taking care of these folks. You need to make sure that you're doing that. And by extent, taking care of all of those that are in need. That's what he says. Because what? Why is that? Folks, that's an example of what's in your heart. That's what he's saying. I want you to understand that James doesn't stop there. James talks about our brethren. Notice chapter 2, verse 15. He says this, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace and be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? Now you take that passage, and you just back up a few passages to verse 27 of chapter 1, and you look at what are you seeing there? You are seeing a religion, James is talking about, of action. You are seeing a religion of doing. It is taking those good things that are in the heart that you should have and converting them into doing good things for others. That's what he's talking about. That's the point he wants us to see. This is our work. This is our work. And I think when I look at that, I almost feel like it's a personal test. A personal test of my religion. A personal test if my religion is pure. Now I know and understand that there are collective action here. We can see that. But James is saying that this is a test of your faith. This is a test of your religion. Your faith. What you do as a Christian. This is the test. I'll tell you what, these things are easy in themselves. Sometimes just slack off on somebody else. Let them do it. We do that a lot. James says, this is a test of your purity with your relationship with God. You want to test? See if you're with God? Check it out. That's what James is saying. He goes on this concept of pure religion. He says not only visiting the widows and the orphans, but also to keep yourself unspotted and unstained from the world. You know, while James is saying that we're to be a distinct people, you know that? We are. We're peculiar people. What makes us distinct and what makes us peculiar is that we serve God, that we're Christians. And it doesn't take too much to be out there to know that nobody's doing that we are distinct, that we are peculiar. You know, when it comes to painting, I'm not worth a nickel. But I'm a paint magnet. I don't care where I'm at. I don't care what I'm wearing. I get paint all over me and over not what it. And I've got to make sure that when I do that, I've got whatever Jeannie says is painting clothes. All right? Which is nothing. But I'll tell you what. I just thought of that. But we could parallel that with what we're saying about the world. About being influenced and stained by the world. Folks, we're in it. We're in this place. But we're not to be a part of it. We're not that close to the world's standards and the values of the standards of the world that they've laid down. One of the problems with that is, folks, they change all the time. Rapidly changing. We talk about that all the time. How the world's so rapidly changing. We constantly see that change. God, however, has a system. His system does not change. Prophet Malachi chapter 3 verse 6, that's what he says. He says, for I, the Lord, do not change. And in fact, his standard, his system does not change. And one of the reasons that they were alive is because of that nature that he had not to change. I'm patient. I'm willing to get through this and be thankful for that. We talked a little bit about that in Bible study this morning. But because I'm patient, that's the reason that you're alive. Because I don't change. Folks, if our religion is pure, our standards are God's. And I'll tell you what, God's standard does not change, nor can we change either. Notice 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3. He says this, verse 14. He says, therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these, be diligent to be found by him. Here we go. Without spot or blemish, he says, and at peace. That's what the Lord is seeking. Without spot, without blemish. So then how does this allow our religion to be pure when you think about that? How does this show us that we are the kind of people that God desires, that we are doing what we're doing is right? You know, our lives, really it's easy. Our lives need to display a trust in God. Our lives need to display that we are practicing what we're teaching, that we're believing what we're teaching, but not only that, that people see us doing, that what we believe is right, that we've incorporated in that in our lives, and that we are actually living a Christian life. Our lives are evident of that. That when people see you, they recognize you as a doer and not just a hearer only. In that same vein, I think it illustrates that we are genuine. Folks, if you're not a Christian that's not a real deal, it's not the real deal. We are genuine in our faith. There is a sense of genuineness. It illustrates a people that are not so much concerned about the outward reputation. We're not so concerned about what people might think. We're not here to keep our family members off our backs. We're here because we have a genuineness of faith. We believe in what we're doing, and we want to pursue that. 1 Peter chapter 1. Notice what he says. He said, now this verse here is kind of on the same thing, but there's a word or two in there that I want us to think about. All right, he says this in verse 6. 1 Peter 1, verse 6. He says, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while is necessary, that you've been grieved by various trials, so that the testing, he says, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, it's more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation, he says, of Jesus Christ. Folks, that's where the genuineness comes out. When the Lord comes again, you know we're going to know who's genuine. And you know what? When the Lord comes again, the test, it's over. There'll not be any more trials. There'll not be any more tests of your faithfulness. When the Lord returns, that time that we had on earth to prove ourselves, it's done. It will be done. And the ones that will be welcomed are the ones that have pure religion, that have practiced what they believe, that have incorporated that in their lives. They will find a place beside the Lord because they were genuine. And so I believe in these short verses that James here has given us really a challenge, a genuine challenge. And we need to truly ask ourselves about our life. Is it genuine? That we must look soberly and honestly at our faith, at our religion, at what we're doing. I'll tell you something, folks. In our middle class bubble, it's real easy to think that this is it right here. It's real easy. Nothing in the world could be farther from the truth. This isn't it. This isn't where it's at. It's out there. And it's in your heart. And it's in your lives. Is your religion worthless? Is your religion genuine? Answer that this morning. If you're here this morning and have never obeyed the gospel of Christ, we'd certainly encourage you to do that. Jesus said, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned. To begin to live with our Lord, you must be in him. You must be where all spiritual blessings are. you can begin a life of genuine service to God this very day. If you have not lived that life, you're a Christian, you want to return to the faith, you want to return to the Lord, ask His forgiveness. Please come as together we stand and sing.